In this Sikha, the Rebbe is going to be discussing the idea of Melochos on Yom Tov. We know that all other Melochos you're not allowed to do on Yom Tov, but of course we're allowed to do things related to food. And the question that's going to be discussed in the Sikha is regarding this permission that we have for preparing food, or Melochos related to food. Is it just that the Torah allowed us to do these Melochos, which technically should also be Asur? Or is it that these ideas, these Melochos, let's say carrying outside or cooking, are things that were never part of the Isur Melacha to start with? The Rebbe starts off by looking at the pasuk in this week's parsha, which starts off by saying, Kol Melacha lo yaseh b'hem, that you're not allowed to do any work on the Yom Tov of Pesach on the first and seventh day. And then the pasuk says, but work of food you are allowed to do. Contrast this with the way it says by other Yom Tovim, where it just says straight out, Kol Melacha, Kol Melechas Avodah lo yisah, you're not allowed to do any work of labor. And it doesn't say that you're not allowed, that you are allowed to do Melochos related to food. So the Ramban explains this by saying that in our parsha that it said, Kol Melacha, any work you're not allowed to do. So that's why the Torah had to say, but work of food you are allowed to do. Whereas by all the other Yom Tovim, since it says Kol Melechas Avodah lo yisah, it specifies what kind of work can't you do. Melechas Avodah, work of labor. Says the Ramban, that's not work of food. That would be called Melechas Hanoah, which Lechatchila then, in other words, if we look at it this way, then the Melacha related to food is not part of the Isur at all of doing on Yom Tov, because it just says, Kol Melechas Avodah lo yisah, don't do any Melacha of labor, which according to the way the Ramban explains, doesn't include at all the Melacha of preparing food. Because really we could look at this idea of the fact of preparing food on Yom Tov or foods Melochos related to food, we can really explain this seemingly in two ways. One way of understanding it is that these Melochos are originally Asur, they're part of the general Isur of Melacha on Yom Tov. It's just that the Torah is giving us a special reason and an allowance to do these Melochos when it's related to food. Whereas, another way of looking at it, and this is the way it seems from the Ramban, is that these Melochos were just lechatchila, from the outset, never part of the Isur at all. The practical difference would be if a person is not eating on Yom Tov, if a person is fasting. So if we say that these Melochos are really technically, inherently Asur, it's just if there's a reason to cook because you need the food, then you are allowed to cook, or then you're allowed to carry the food outside, for example. But someone that's fasting has no reason to be dealing with the food, shouldn't be allowed to do these Melochos. Whereas if we say these Melochos were never in the category of Melacha to start with, and even if you don't have a personal benefit out of it, you should still be allowed to do these Melochos, which were never Asur. Just like a person in the middle of the week is allowed to be cooking for no reason whatsoever. The Rebbe says seemingly this would actually be the machloikas of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, where they argue whether a person is allowed to carry outside a child, it's not for food. A person is allowed to carry outside a lulav. Beis Shammai says you're not allowed. Beis Hillel says you are allowed. The Gemara explains that the argument is that Beis Hillel says that once a malacha is allowed to be done, it could be for food, then it's allowed to be done for anything else. Whereas Beis Shammai says no. You don't say that. It's only if it's for the food itself. So seemingly we could connect it to this same idea that we were just speaking about. Seemingly, Beis Shammai is saying that when it says that the Torah says you're allowed to do Melochos for food, this is the Torah is giving you a specific reason and way how you could do these Melochos. So it's only if it's going to be for food. And therefore, if it's not for food, it's just clear cut that you're not allowed to do it. Whereas Beis Hillel would say, no, these Melochos were never part of the Isur from the beginning. And therefore, you could do the Melacha for no matter what reason it is. The Rebbe brings the Alter Rebbe, which causes a little bit of a difficulty over here, because the Alter Rebbe starts off when speaking about the Melochos on Yom Tov, he speaks about the idea that you're not allowed to do Melechas Avodah, you're not allowed to do a work of labor, and he says what that means is any work that's not related to food or drink. And then he says, the Alter Rebbe goes on to speak about that the Melochos of Oichel Nefesh, the Torah gave us a permission, an allowance to do them for the sake of food. And he brings the pasuk of our parasha, which seems to be that the Alter Rebbe started off by saying that these Melochos were never part of the Isur, but then he seems to be saying that the Torah is giving us a special allowance for these Melochos, making it sound that it is part of the Isur. So we'll get back to that a little bit later. First, the Rebbe brings a Rashi and a Tosfos on explaining what Beis Hillel says, or rather defining what Beis Hillel says. When Beis Hillel says that you're allowed to do the Melacha even for no need, so Rashi is of the opinion that there actually has to be no need whatsoever. So you could just be carrying outside or cooking for no reason whatsoever at all related to your personal benefit. Whereas Tosfos says that even midoraisa there would still need to be some sort of benefit. And the Rebbe is going to discuss why that is. But first the Rebbe says that seemingly, in the meantime, we still want to learn that both Rashi and Tosfos would agree that generally Beis Hillel holds that the Melochos related to Oichel Nefesh were never part of the Isur. Because if they are part of the Isur, according to Tosfos then, that says you need to have some sort of benefit at all, why should you need to have any sort of benefit? Seemingly, if we're saying you don't need to have any sort of benefit, it's because if the Beis Hillel says you could do it even if there's no need, then it should be that even Tosfos would agree that means that there was no Isur to start with. But the question then would be, then why does Tosfos say that you need to have at least some sort of benefit from it at all? So in order to explain this, the Rebbe says we could explain Rashi and Tosfos' argument in the following way. They both agree, so far we're saying, they both agree that Beis Hillel would say that the Melacha of Oichel Nefesh is not part of the Isur at all. However, according to Rashi, it would mean that the Torah is giving us a definition of these Melachos. In other words, as which kind of Melachos are Asur if it's nothing to do with Oichel Nefesh. That means any time a Melacha is going to be related to Oichel Nefesh, automatically, no matter how I do it, it's completely mutar. So cooking, taking outside, I can do for no matter what. Whereas Tosfos is defining it slightly different. Tosfos is going to say, yes, it's true that these Melochos are not part of the Isur at all, but what does the Torah define as the Melochos that are not part of the Isur? That's going to depend on my intention of why I'm doing the Melacha. If it's a Melacha that I'm doing for the purpose of some sort of pleasure, of food or otherwise some sort of pleasure, then it's the kind of Melacha that's completely taken out of the category of Isur. But not that the Melacha inherently, automatically, is if it's a Melacha, for example, like cooking, doesn't mean that any time I cook is going to be mutter. According to Tosfos, it does have to do with the intention of the person. But the bottom line from all of this is that the Rebbe in the meantime is learning that both Rashi and Tosfos would agree that as long as it's a Melacha that's being done, according to Rashi, if it's a Melacha that can be done for Oichel Nefesh, according to Tosfos, that I'm doing it for Oichel Nefesh, according to both of them at least, it's a Melacha that was never part of the Isur Lichatchila. And therefore the question again would be, why is the Alter Rebbe seem to implying that there is a heter, that the Torah is just allowing me to do it, implying that it was Asur. So therefore the Rebbe is going to explain now Tosfos in a little bit of a different way, that Tosfos would actually explain Beis Hillel that no, these Melochos of Oichel Nefesh are Asur to begin with. In other words, they are part of the general klal of Melochos that are Asur on Yom Tov. It's just that the Torah gave us a special allowance to do these Melochos for Oichel Nefesh. So then what's Beis Hillel saying different to Beis Shammai? Because according to Beis Shammai, these Melochos were only pushed off for the sake of food, but not that they became now completely permissible, and therefore were very restricted, very limited, only if it's being done for the purpose of Oichel Nefesh directly, so I can't carry anything else outside, for example. Whereas, according to Tosfos, what Beis Hillel is saying is that once the Torah is telling us about Oichel Nefesh, what the Torah is saying is not that we're just pushing away the Isur, but now it became completely permissible, and therefore it could be done even if it's for a different purpose, not for food, but at least that there is some sort of benefit in it at all. And this is what Beis Hillel means, meaning to say that when I'm allowed to cook food, just like I'm allowed to cook food a little bit more than what I need, or a lot more than what I need, because Beis Hillel is saying I could do now anything with cooking, or anything with taking out more than what I need. So Beis Hillel is saying, just like with the quantity, I could do things more than what I need. So too with quality, even if it's not directly food related, as long as there's some pleasure involved, this is also considered some sort of hana, which would be similar in some way to oichal nefesh, and therefore the Torah is allowing it, but not saying that it was never part of the Isser to start with. So again, different to what we thought originally. Now the Rebbe is learning is that the Melochos were part of the Isser, and the Torah just gave us a certain allowance, which would explain the Alter Rebbe in how he explains this idea of oichal nefesh that is only as given and as an allowance, which is very interesting. What the Rebbe is actually also explaining over here along the way is that this is why in our parsha, the parsha first tells us kol malacha, you shouldn't do any work, and then the Torah gives us an exception, but malacha for food you're allowed, which seems to be implying that the malacha is aser. Why doesn't the Torah just say kol malachas avodah, work of labor is not allowed, so we would never even speak about the malacha of oichel nefesh? Because the way we're learning now is that even Beis Hillel, according to Tosfos, and so too according to the Alter Rebbe, would say that the malachas are generally asur, but the Torah gave us a special allowance to be able to enjoy the food on Yom Tov and so on. And the Rebbe concludes with a beautiful hira over here from the fact that the Torah gave us a permission to do malachas that are technically asur on Yom Tov, all for the benefit of our simchas Yom Tov and our eating on Yom Tov. We could see how important simcha on Yom Tov is. And the Rebbe finishes off by saying an unbelievable thing. We know that the ha'ara, the oir of Yom Tov shines down to every day of the year. According to this, says the Rebbe, that simcha is such an important part of Yom Tov. So the simcha that the Yid feels on Yom Tov, this very simcha needs to be drawn down and felt every single day of the year.